In the Montana prairies, silence was her only companion. Her hands, roughened by solitude, had forgotten the warmth of other hands. Amelia Hartwell, at 25, was barely a whisper among the tall grass, a woman whom life had taught that love was not for her, until the storm brought to her door eyes the color of clear sky, eyes that did not judge, that saw beyond her invisible scars. In the patter of rain on the wooden roof, a story began to be written that neither of them expected. Like the plum blossoms that are reborn each spring, so blooms the heart that dares to trust again. If this story awakens something in your soul, give us a like as one would leave a flower on a grave that no longer hurts to visit. And tell us, how do you think this story of Amelia and the stranger that the storm brought into her life will end? Your voice is part of the echo that keeps stories of hope alive. In the spring of 1883, when the wind caressed the Montana prairies with invisible fingers, Amelia Hartwell contemplated the horizon from the worn porch of her cabin. At 25, her face had already acquired that indecipherable quality of someone who has learned to expect little from life. Her hands, rough from constant work, rested on her lap with the stillness of one who has tamed even the smallest of her movements. The cabin, inherited after her father's death the previous year, stood like a solitary monument among the tall grass. The silence that inhabited those walls was not new to her. She had grown up in it, had breathed it every day since death took her mother when she was barely 7 years old. Her father, William Hartwell, had been a man of few words and fewer caresses, whose rigidity seemed to increase with each passing winter. He had taught her to shoot, to hunt, to cultivate the land, but never to feel deserving of tenderness. Amelia stood up and surveyed the property that now belonged to her, the barn with its sagging roof, the chicken coop that needed repairs, the garden that was beginning to show the first green shoots. All of it was hers, and yet nothing seemed truly her own. In town, they called her the one nobody wanted, a whisper she had heard too many times while buying provisions or attending the scarce religious services. Those words had been carved into her interior until they became a truth she did not question. The shadows were beginning to lengthen when Amelia entered the cabin. She lit the oil lamp, and its flickering light drew dancing shadows on the wooden walls. On the mantel rested the only portrait she kept of her mother, a woman with a shy smile and deep eyes that Amelia had inherited. Sometimes on nights like this she spoke to that portrait in whispers, sharing thoughts she would never utter to others. "I saw a deer at the north boundary today," she told the silence. "It had eyes like yours, Mother. It didn't run when I approached." The crackling of wood in the stove was the only response. Outside, the first stars were beginning to twinkle in a sky that gradually darkened. Amelia prepared a simple soup, ate unhurriedly, and then took the book she reread every spring, a worn volume of poems that had belonged to her mother. She didn't understand all the words, but the cadence of those verses provided her with an inexplicable comfort. Before going to bed, Amelia went out to the porch again. Night had spread its dark mantle over the prairie, transforming it into a black, infinite ocean. In the distance, the solitary howl of a wolf seemed the perfect echo of what she felt inside, a call without response, a voice that was lost in the immensity. The sky dawned with that peculiar grayish tone that announced a storm. Amelia observed it with concern while feeding the chickens. Her fingers felt the electricity in the air long before the first thunder rumbled in the distance. She worked hurriedly, securing everything that might fly away, bringing additional firewood inside, preparing for the isolation the rain would bring. The first drops fell thick and spaced like reluctant tears. Soon they turned into curtains of water that blurred the horizon. Amelia, sheltered by the window, observed the unleashed fury of nature with a mixture of respect and familiarity. Spring storms in Montana could be relentless, but they also brought with them the promise of renewal. It was then that she saw him, a dark silhouette emerging through the curtain of water, a rider hunched over his mount. Amelia narrowed her eyes, trying to discern if that apparition was real or a product of her solitary imagination. The horse was visibly limping, and the man seemed to be struggling against the wind, threatening to knock him down. Without thinking too much, Amelia took the rifle she always kept nearby. She loaded it with precise movements her father had instilled in her and went out to the porch. The rain soaked her instantly, but she kept the weapon steady, aiming at the stranger approaching. "Stop right there!" she shouted, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "What are you looking for?" "On my property." The rider slowly raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. When he was close enough, Amelia could distinguish his features. A face weathered by the elements, several days' growth of beard, and eyes of such a clear blue they were disturbing even under the dim light of the storm. "Pardon the intrusion, ma'am," he said in a hoarse but calm voice. "My name is Silas McCade. My horse has lost a shoe and the storm caught us on the way to Fort Benton. I'm just looking for shelter until it lets up." Amelia kept the rifle in position, scrutinizing every detail of the man. He didn't look like an outlaw. His clothes, though, worn, were clean, and his manners denoted a certain education. But experience had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. "You can spend the night in the barn," she finally said, lowering the weapon slightly. "There's dry hay for your horse. I'll bring you something to eat when you've tended to the animal." Silas nodded with a gesture that seemed almost reverential. "I deeply appreciate it." Amelia observed how the man led his horse toward the barn, walking alongside the animal with care not to force the injured leg. There was something in his way of moving, a gentleness that contradicted his rough appearance, that caused Amelia to feel a pang of curiosity, an almost forgotten feeling. When she returned to the interior of the cabin, her heart was beating hard. Not from fear, she told herself, but from the strangeness of having another human presence so close after such a long time of solitude. The storm continued throughout the night, shaking the walls of the cabin with its unleashed fury. Amelia slept little, with the rifle beside the bed and her ear alert to any sound that might indicate the stranger had left the barn to approach the house. But she heard only the wind and the rain, a natural concert she knew too well. At dawn, when the clouds began to disperse, leaving behind a washed and brilliant sky, Amelia prepared coffee and a simple stew with the provisions she had. It wasn't her custom to share her food, but something in that man's tired gaze had awakened in her an almost forgotten impulse, that of compassion. She walked to the barn cautiously, carrying a tray covered with a cloth. The aroma of hot coffee mingled with the smell of wet earth. Upon entering, she found Silas McCade sitting on a bale of hay, carefully examining his horse's hoof. Upon seeing her, he rose with a fluid movement that denoted respect, but not civility. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, and Amelia was surprised to hear her surname. "I hope I haven't disturbed your rest." "Amelia," she corrected dryly, placing the tray on a barrel. "I live alone, so there's no need for formalities. How did you know my surname?" Silas gestured toward the entrance of the barn where, carved into the wood, the initials W.H. could be distinguished. William Hartwell. His name was known as far as Fort Benton. "A respected man, though not precisely for his affable character," he commented with a slight smile that softened the harshness of his words. Amelia nodded, impressed by his perspicacity. Few associated those initials with her father, and even fewer dared to mention his temperament. "He was my father," she confirmed. "He died last winter." "I'm sorry," Silas responded, and in his blue eyes there wasn't the usual pity that Amelia detested, but a genuine understanding. Losing family always leaves a void that nothing seems to fill. Those words, pronounced with an almost painful simplicity, touched something inside Amelia. She didn't respond, limiting herself to observing how the man took the cup of coffee with hands that showed old scars and calluses from hard work. "Your horse," she said finally, pointing to the animal that was eating peacefully. "Will it be able to continue its journey?" Silas shook his head. "It needs rest and a new horseshoe. I know something about blacksmithing. If you allow me to use some tools, I could repair it myself before continuing." Amelia hesitated for a moment. Allowing a stranger to stay longer than necessary contradicted everything her father had taught her about caution and distrust. But there was something about Silas McCade, a quietness in his gaze, an absence of threat, that was disconcerting. "The tools are in the shed," she finally conceded. "You can use them, but I'd like to know more about you and your destination." An almost imperceptible smile formed on Silas's lips, "That's fair," he said, drinking the last sip of coffee. "I'll tell you while I work, if that seems good to you." Amelia nodded and withdrew, aware that she had just broken one of the rules she had imposed on herself, keeping distance from strangers. But as she returned to the cabin, under the sun that was beginning to warm the wet earth, she wondered if perhaps it wasn't time to rewrite some of those rules. During the next 3 days, a strange routine was established on the Hartwell property. Silas worked from dawn, first repairing his horse's shoe with a skill that spoke of years of practice, then spontaneously taking care of small repairs that the cabin needed. Without Amelia asking him to, he fixed the loose boards on the porch, reinforced the chicken coop door that the wind threatened to tear off, and straightened the fence that delimited the garden. Amelia observed him from a distance, divided between the inherent distrust her father had instilled in her and a curiosity that grew as the hours passed. Silas worked with a serene concentration, as if each task, no matter how small, deserved his full attention. His hands, large and calloused, moved with surprising delicacy. When he hammered, he did so with precise blows. When he sawed, each movement seemed exactly measured to not waste energy. On the 3rd day, while Amelia was collecting eggs in the newly repaired chicken coop, she caught herself smiling. It had been so long since she had experienced the sensation that someone else cared for her well-being, even if in such an indirect and silent manner. That afternoon, when the sun was beginning to descend, Amelia approached Silas, who was sitting on the porch carving a small piece of wood with his knife. "Your horse is recovered now," she said, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "You could continue your journey tomorrow." Silas raised his gaze. His eyes, the color of the sky on clear days, seemed to read something in Amelia's face that she herself didn't know. "I could," he conceded, returning to his carving. "But I've noticed that the barn roof has a leak right above where you store the grain. With the next rain, you'll lose the entire harvest." Amelia felt a knot in her throat. It was true. She had seen the leak, but she didn't have enough strength to move the beams that needed to be replaced. "I haven't asked you to fix my barn," she said, though without the firmness she intended. "No, you haven't," Silas responded with a slight smile. "But I would like to do it if you'll allow me, as thanks for your hospitality." There was a prolonged silence. Amelia observed Silas's hands, which had stopped moving over the wood. He waited, patient, without pressuring her. "All right," she said finally, "you can stay another day." Silas nodded with a gesture that might have seemed solemn if it weren't for the almost childlike gleam that appeared in his eyes. "I promise you. Won't regret it. I have a good hand for roofs." That night, while they silently ate the stew that Amelia had prepared, she found herself observing Silas with new eyes. He wasn't just a stranger that the storm had brought to her door. He was a man who seemed to understand the value of work well done, of shared silence, of the small gestures that built trust without the need for grand promises. When he retired to the barn to sleep, Silas left on the table the object he had been carving, a small wooden figure representing a deer with surprisingly expressive eyes. Amelia took it between her fingers, feeling the smoothness that the man had managed to coax from the rough wood. It was a simple gift without pretensions, but in that simplicity lay its beauty. She placed it beside her mother's portrait before going to bed. That night, for the first time in a long time, Amelia slept without startling, lulled by the novel sensation of not being completely alone. As May advanced and the fields covered themselves with wildflowers, Silas's presence on the Hartwell property ceased to be an anomaly and became a constant. One day to fix the roof had transformed into a week and then into 2. Now, as June approached with its promise of intense heat, it seemed as if he had always been there, a hard-working shadow that moved about the property with the familiarity of one who has found his place. Amelia had stopped wondering when he would leave. Instead, each morning she awakened with the comforting certainty that she wouldn't be alone facing the day's tasks. Silas had proven to be a man of few words, but many skills. He knew how to tame the stubborn mule that bit anyone who approached, had improved the traps that Amelia used to hunt rabbits, and knew secrets about cultivating the land that even her father, with all his experience, had never mentioned to her. That afternoon, while they were picking wild raspberries at the edge of the forest that bordered the property, Amelia cut herself on a thorn. It wasn't a serious wound, barely a scratch, but blood quickly welled up, forming a scarlet drop on her white skin. "Let me help you," said Silas, taking her hand with a delicacy that contrasted with his rough appearance. He took out a surprisingly clean handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around her injured finger. The contact of his hands, rough but gentle, provoked in Amelia a wave of heat that rose from her chest to her cheeks. "It's nothing," she murmured, withdrawing her hand perhaps too abruptly. "I've had worse injuries." Silas observed her with that gaze of his that seemed to see beyond words. "I know," he said simply. "You have old scars on your hands, hands that have worked hard from a very young age." Amelia lowered her gaze to her own hands, surprised by the observation. No one before had noticed those small marks that told the story of her life. The circular burn from the branding iron her father had made her hold when she was 12, the elongated scar from when she learned to use the hunting knife, the multiple, small marks from cuts and scratches that spoke of a hard existence in a land that didn't forgive mistakes. "My father believed that pain teaches better than words," she said, and she surprised herself by sharing something so intimate. "He said a girl must learn early that life is not kind, especially in these lands." Silas nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Perfectly. My father thought the same," he responded, and in his voice was an echo of old wounds. "But he was wrong, Amelia. Pain only teaches fear. It is gentleness that truly teaches how to live." Those words, pronounced with a quiet conviction, resonated inside Amelia as if someone had touched a hidden string in her soul. Never before had she questioned her father's teachings, assuming that his harshness was simply the way the world worked. The idea that there might exist another way of learning, of growing, of relating to others, was as novel as it was disturbing. "Is that why you're kind to me?" she asked, and her voice sounded more vulnerable than she would have wished. "To teach me something?" Silas smiled, and that smile transformed his habitually serious face into something luminous. "I'm kind to you because you deserve it, Amelia. We all deserve kindness, especially those whom life has treated harshly." They continued picking raspberries, in silence, but something had changed in the air between them. Silas's words had opened a crack in the wall that Amelia had built around her emotions, allowing a ray of light to filter toward the shadows where she kept her most painful memories. That night, while they prepared dinner together, Amelia found herself observing Silas with new eyes, wondering what other simple but profound truths that man whom destiny had brought to her door kept inside. Night had spread its dark mantle over the prairie, studded with thousands of stars that shone with a clarity that only the clean air of Montana allowed. Amelia and Silas were sitting on the porch, each with a steaming cup of coffee between their hands. The silence between them had become comfortable with the passing of days, like their own language that needed no translation. Silas's coffee had a different taste, more intense and slightly bitter. He prepared it with a method he had learned during his travels. He let the beans roast a bit more than usual and then added a pinch of salt to enhance the flavor. It was a small ritual that Amelia had begun to await each night, with an anticipation she didn't dare to name. "You've never told me why you were going to Fort Benton," said Amelia, breaking the silence. The question had been in her mind since the first day, but only now did she feel enough confidence to formulate it. Silas took a sip of coffee before responding. His profile, silhouetted against the starry sky, seemed carved in stone. "I was looking for someone," he said finally, "an old comrade from the war. We served together in the Confederate Army." Amelia looked at him with surprise. She had never imagined Silas as a soldier, though now that he mentioned it, she could see in him that silent discipline, that capacity to endure discomfort without complaining. "You fought in the Civil War?" she asked, trying to calculate his age. Silas didn't seem much older than her, perhaps in his 30s. "I was barely a boy," he confirmed, and his eyes acquired a distance that suggested he was seeing something beyond the visible horizon. "I enlisted at 17, along with my younger brother, Thomas. He was 15, but he lied about his age. Our father was proud. He said we would go to fight for a noble cause." He paused, and Amelia could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. Thomas didn't return, she ventured in a low voice. He died at Gettysburg. I was by his side when a bullet pierced his chest. His voice remained firm, but his hands tensed around the cup. He died asking me for water, water that I didn't have to give him. Amelia felt a knot in her throat. The image of a young man dying far from home, with only his brother as a witness to his last moments, was heartbreaking. "I'm so sorry," she said, knowing that the words were insufficient in the face of such loss. "Since then I've lived with that sensation," continued Silas, as if he needed to get out the words he had kept inside for so long. "That of being a survivor without purpose, the one who stayed behind when others, perhaps more deserving, were gone." Amelia then understood what she had seen in Silas's eyes from the first day. It wasn't just the look of a man tired from the journey, but of someone who carried an invisible weight, a debt that he felt he could never repay. "After the war, I became a wanderer," he continued. "I've worked on ranches, in mines, on railroads. I've never stayed too long in one place. It's as if I'm looking for something I can't name." "And that friend in Fort Benton?" asked Amelia softly. "Another survivor. He wrote to me saying he had found a purpose, a place to belong. I wanted to see if it was true, if it's possible to leave the ghosts behind." A reflective silence settled between them. Amelia contemplated the stars, thinking about how different and yet how similar their wounds were. She, marked by the absence of love. He, by the overwhelming presence of loss. "I've never been kissed," she said suddenly, and the words escaped her lips before she could stop them. An intense blush covered her cheeks, but in the darkness of the porch she was grateful it was invisible. She expected laughter, maybe even incredulity. Instead, Silas looked at her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Not because no one wanted to," he responded with gentleness, "but because you've never been allowed to believe you deserve it." The precision with which he had captured the truth of her existence left her speechless. Silas had not expressed pity or condescension. He had simply seen what no one else had bothered to look at. "Then it will be in your time," he added, and in that simple phrase was a promise that made Amelia's heart beat forcefully against her ribs. "When you're ready." That night, as she lay in her bed listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie, Amelia realized that, for the first time in her life, someone had granted her the power to choose, to decide, to determine her own pace, and that freedom, so simple and yet so profound, felt like the first breath after having been underwater for too long. The day of the monthly market arrived with a clear sky that promised heat. Amelia prepared herself with more care than usual, choosing her only dress that didn't show visible mending and braiding her brown hair with a ribbon that had belonged to her mother. She didn't want to analyze too much why this time her appearance mattered to her. When for years she had ignored the critical looks of the town's inhabitants, Silas would accompany her. The idea had arisen naturally during breakfast when she mentioned the need to acquire seeds and some tools. He had offered to drive the cart, arguing that he knew a shortcut that would reduce the travel time. Amelia had accepted with a neutrality that contradicted the sudden flutter in her stomach. The road to town passed in a comfortable silence, occasionally interrupted by Silas's observations about the landscape or practical questions about what they needed to buy. The cart advanced at a steady pace, rocking its occupants with each bump in the road. "Does it bother you that I'm accompanying you?" asked Silas when the first houses of the town appeared on the horizon. "I can wait on the outskirts if you prefer. To do your shopping alone." Amelia glanced at him sideways. He wore a clean shirt that she herself had washed the day before, and he had shaved that morning, revealing a face younger than his usual beard suggested. There was something in his profile that inspired confidence, a solidity that contrasted with the fragility she felt growing inside her. "No," she responded with a firmness that surprised her. "I prefer that you come with me." The main street of the town bustled with activity. Farmers, merchants, and entire families mingled in a colorful tapestry of humanity that had always made Amelia feel like a discordant note. As they walked among the stalls, she noticed the looks that followed them. Curious, speculative, some openly hostile. "Miss Hartwell," greeted Mrs. Peterson, owner of the general store, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise to see you accompanied." Her gaze ran over Silas from head to toe, evaluating him with the precision of someone accustomed to calculating the value of merchandise. Silas McCade, he introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat with an educated but not servile gesture. I'm helping Miss Hartwell with some repairs on her property. The explanation, offered naturally, seemed to momentarily satisfy the woman's curiosity, though Amelia could see how her eyes shone with the anticipation of a new rumor to share. They toured the different stalls, acquiring what was necessary. Amelia was conscious of how Silas's presence at her side altered the way she was perceived. The same people who before barely directed a curt greeting to her now stopped to converse, offering information about the best seeds or asking about the state of the harvest. It was beside the fabric stall where the encounter occurred that Amelia had feared since they set foot in town. Margaret Simmons, daughter of the banker and self-proclaimed social leader of the small settlement, approached with that elegant walk that had always made Amelia feel like a clumsy peasant. "Amelia Hartwell," she said, with a smile that was more like a grimace. "What a pleasant surprise, and I see you found company." The pause before the last word was loaded with insinuations. Amelia felt her cheeks flush, but before she could respond, Silas stepped forward. "Miss Simmons," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Margaret's smile falter. "I've heard about you. Your father is known as far as Fort Benton for his particular way of doing business." The ambiguity of the comment made Margaret narrow her eyes, unable to determine if it was a compliment or a veiled criticism. "And you are?" she asked, composing herself. "A friend of the Hartwell family," responded Silas with an affable smile that contradicted the firmness of his gaze. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have matters to attend to." With a slight pressure on Amelia's elbow, he guided her away from the stall. When they were at a prudent distance, she let out the air she didn't know she was holding. "Thank you," she murmured. "Margaret has always had a special gift for making me feel insignificant." Silas looked at her with an expression that mixed understanding and something deeper that Amelia didn't dare to name. "Nothing that woman says or thinks can diminish what you are, Amelia," he said in a quiet but firm voice. "Your value doesn't depend on her approval." Those words, simple but powerful, deposited themselves in Amelia's heart like seeds in fertile soil. As they returned to the cart with their purchases, she felt a new lightness, as if an invisible burden had begun to lighten on her shoulders. On the way back, when the sun was beginning to descend, tinting the sky with orange tones, Amelia looked at Silas out of the corner of her eye. His profile silhouetted against the horizon seemed to belong to that landscape, as if he had always been there waiting for her. "Why did you stay?" she finally asked, giving voice to the question she had been avoiding for weeks. "Your horse is healed, the repairs are done. Nothing keeps you here." Silas kept his gaze on the road, but a slight smile formed on his lips. "Maybe I was tired of wandering," he responded, "or maybe I found something that made me want to stay." He said no more, and Amelia didn't press. But as the cart advanced under the twilight sky, she felt that something inside her was expanding, like a space closed for too long that finally received fresh air and light. The morning of that Saturday in June dawned with a special clarity, as if the world had washed itself during the night. Amelia awakened before dawn with a sensation of anticipation that she didn't remember ever experiencing. She dressed carefully, choosing her lightest cotton blouse, the one she reserved for special occasions that rarely came. Silas had suggested the day before that they visit the small wild plum forest that grew about 3 kilometers from the property. "They're in bloom now," he had said with that contained smile that made his eyes shine. "It's a spectacle that deserves to be seen." Amelia knew that place well. As a child, her father would take her there every spring in one of the few gestures of tenderness she remembered from him. Together, they would observe the trees covered with white flower, Seattle listening to the buzz of the bees that worked among the petals. It was a precious memory, one of the few not stained by William Hartwell's usual harshness. When she went out to the porch, Silas was already there, holding the reins of the 2 horses he had saddled. His now recovered from its limp, and the tame mare that Amelia rode on her scarce outings. "I thought it would be pleasant to ride instead of using the cart," he explained, offering her a hand to help her mount. "The morning is too beautiful." to waste on dusty roads. Amelia accepted his help, feeling the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her blouse. For an instant they were so close that she could perceive his scent, a mixture of homemade soap, leather, and something indefinable that was simply Silas. They rode side by side in a comfortable silence, enjoying the freshness of the morning. Here the prairie stretched before them, like an undulating green ocean under the breeze. In the distance the mountains stood out against the sky with a sharpness that only the clean air of Montana allowed. "How long has it been since you visited the plum forest?" asked Silas after a while. Amelia reflected for a moment. 8 years, perhaps more. "My father stopped taking me when I turned 17. He said it was time to focus on more practical things than wildflowers." She didn't add that she had felt that decision as the loss of something precious, as if her father had officially declared the end of any indulgence toward beauty or contemplation. "Practical things have their place," commented Silas, looking at her out of the corner of his eye. "But so does beauty. Both are necessary to truly live, not just to survive." When they reached the edge of the forest, Amelia held her breath. The plum trees were in full bloom, their branches covered with small white flowers that looked like freshly fallen snow. The contrast with the intense green of the leaves and the blue of the sky created an image that no painter could have captured in its entirety. They dismounted and tied the horses to a tree at the edge of the clearing. Silas spread a blanket over the grass and from his saddlebag took out a small package that contained freshly baked bread, cheese, and dried apples. "A picnic," said Amelia, surprised by the foresight. "I thought we could spend a few hours here." He responded with a shy smile that gave him an almost juvenile appearance. The spectacle deserves to be savored at leisure. They sat together, eating in a silence interrupted only by the singing of birds and the constant buzz of bees working among the flowers. The air was impregnated with a sweet and subtle aroma that Amelia remembered from her childhood, but that now seemed more intense, more present. "My mother loved plum blossoms," she said, surprising herself by sharing a memory that she had kept, guarded for so long. "She said they were like stars that had decided to come down to earth to keep us company." Silas looked at her attentively, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face. "She was a poetic woman," he commented softly. "She was," nodded Amelia. "She had a book of poems that she read every night before sleeping. My father considered it a waste of time, but she insisted that beautiful words nourish the soul as much as bread nourishes the body." "A wise woman, as well as poetic," smiled Silas. "Do you remember her well?" Amelia shook her head. "She died when I was 7. I remember fragments, the sound of her voice singing me to sleep, the smell of her homemade lavender perfume, the sensation of her soft hands on my forehead when I had a fever. But her face—" She paused, with a knot in her throat. "Her face fades a little more each year. Sometimes I fear a day will come when I won't be able to remember her at all." Silas remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. "There are people who never completely leave us," he said finally. "They live in our gestures, in the words we use, in the way we look at the world. Your mother lives in you, Amelia. In your strength, in your hidden gentleness, in the way you appreciate beauty despite everything life has taught you about harshness." Those words touched something deep in Amelia, a place she had kept closed for so long that she had almost forgotten its existence. She felt her eyes moisten and looked away, ashamed of her own vulnerability. Silas, with delicacy, took her hand. His fingers, rough from work but incredibly gentle, intertwined with hers. He said nothing, simply remained there, offering a silent anchor while she navigated through long repressed emotions. When Amelia finally looked at him again, she found in his blue eyes not pity, but understanding. And something more, something that made her heart beat with a new and unknown rhythm. It was then that it happened. With the naturalness of rain falling on dry earth, Silas leaned toward her, and their lips met in a kiss as soft as the flowers that surrounded them. A kiss that tasted of promise, of new beginning, of all the words that had never been said but that now floated between them like the plum blossoms themselves, white and perfect in their simplicity. When they separated, Amelia kept her eyes closed, a moment longer, wanting to preserve the sensation, Upon opening them, she saw that Silas was observing her with a mixture of amazement and devotion that no one had ever directed at her. "It was worth waiting for," she murmured, and a smile, the first truly free one in years, formed on her lips. The following days passed in a kind of lucid dream for Amelia. The world seemed to have acquired more intense colors, sharper sounds, as if the kiss in the plum forest had awakened not only her heart but also her senses. The daily tasks, feeding the animals, working in the garden, preparing meals, acquired an almost ceremonial quality when she performed them alongside Silas or under his attentive gaze. And yet, in the midst of this new clarity, a shadow began to grow. At first it was barely perceptible, like a distant cloud on a sunny day. But as the days passed, it became denser, more insistent. Fear. It wasn't a fear of Silas. He had demonstrated with every gesture, with every word and every silence, that he was a man of honor and gentleness. The fear was deeper, more ancestral. The fear that happiness, like everything good she had known in her life, would be ephemeral. That, like the plum blossoms, it would bloom briefly, only to vanish without a trace. One afternoon, while they were sewing together on the porch, he repairing a leather harness, she mending a shirt, Silas casually mentioned plans for the autumn, reinforcing the cabin against the cold, building an additional shed to store firewood. "Winter here can be brutal," he said, with the naturalness of one who prepares for something inevitable. "We'll need to be well supplied. We'll need." The word reverberated in Amelia's mind like a bell. It implied permanence, continuity, a shared future that extended beyond the summer. The idea was as beautiful as it was terrifying. That night, while Silas slept in the small adjoining room that had previously been her father's office, for although their relationship had evolved, both maintained a physical distance that respected conventions, Amelia remained awake, looking at the wooden ceiling above her bed. Her father's words of warning seemed to whisper from the walls. "People always leave, Amelia. You can only trust yourself." Hadn't that been the lesson of her life? Her mother left first, taken by a fever that no home remedy could combat. Then, one by one, the few friends of her childhood, attracted by larger cities or marriages that took them far away. Even her father, in his way, had gone long before death claimed him, retreating to an interior place where she could not follow him. Why would Silas be different? He was a man accustomed to wandering, a restless soul marked by war and loss. What prevented him from waking up one day and deciding that Montana no longer held him, that the horizon called more strongly than she did? The next morning, Silas immediately noticed the change in her. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, her responses were curt. Her body tensed when he came too close. "Something worries you," he finally said while they shared lunch. It wasn't a question but an observation pronounced with the same certainty with which he would comment on the weather. Amelia looked away, concentrating on meticulously cutting the bread she had in front of her. "I'm fine," she responded, with a voice that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Silas waited, that gift of his of not filling silences with unnecessary words. Finally, when it became evident that she would say no more, he spoke softly. "Fear is a natural companion when something important is at stake," he said. "Don't apologize for feeling it." Amelia raised her gaze, surprised by the precision with which he had identified the emotion that tormented her. "How—" she began, but stopped, unable to formulate the complete question. "I know fear well," he responded, with a sad smile. "It has been my companion for a long time. The fear of not being enough, of not deserving peace after the war, that each moment of happiness is only a prelude to a new loss." He put his fork on the table and extended his hand, palm up, in an invitation gesture that didn't demand to be accepted. "I can't promise you that I won't have difficult days, Amelia. Days when memories weigh too much or when doubts assault me. But I can promise you this. As long as I have breath, as long as I have strength in my hands and clarity in my mind, each morning I will choose to stay. I will choose to build something with you. I will choose to believe that we deserve more than just surviving." Amelia contemplated Silas's extended hand. In his calloused palms, she saw the story of a man who had known hard work, loss, wandering, But she also saw the possibility of something new. A home not made of boards and nails, but of promises fulfilled day after day. Slowly, like one approaching a flame that can burn as much as it can warm, she placed her hand on his. "I'm afraid," she finally admitted, and saying the words aloud was like releasing a weight she had been carrying for too long. Afraid to believe, to hope, to build something that might collapse. Silas closed his fingers gently around hers. "The fear won't disappear overnight," he said in a quiet voice, "but we can learn to live with it, to not allow it to govern us, step by step, day by day." That night, sitting on the porch under a sky studded with stars, they talked as they never had before. Of fears and hopes, of visible and invisible scars, of futures that once seemed impossible, but that now began to take shape on the horizon of their lives. Not all doubts were dispelled, not all questions found answers, but in the space between them something new began to grow, the fragile but resilient seed of trust. The summer community dance was a tradition in the small town near the Hartwell property. Each year, when July reached its midpoint and the days stretched lazily under the Montana sun, the inhabitants gathered in the community barn, decorated with wildflowers and paper lanterns. It was an event that Amelia had rarely attended since, reaching adulthood, preferring the solitude of her cabin to curious looks and barely disguised comments. This year, however, Silas had insisted that they go together. "It's important to be part of the community," he had said while they repaired the corral fence together. As difficult as it sometimes is. Amelia had agreed with reluctance, more to please him than out of any real desire to socialize. And so on the afternoon of the dance, she found herself in front of the cracked mirror in her room, wearing the only dress she kept for special occasions, a simple light blue model that had belonged to her mother and that she had adapted to. Her taller, slimmer figure. When Silas saw her emerge from the room, his expression of sincere admiration made Amelia feel a warmth that rose from her chest to her cheeks. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and in his voice was a reverence that no elaborate compliment could have equaled. The journey to town passed in nervous silence on Amelia's part. As they approached, and the first notes of violin and accordion became audible in the distance, she felt her stomach contract with apprehension. "We don't have to stay long," Silas assured, as if he had read her thoughts. "Just long enough to share a dance and a piece of cake." Upon arriving at the illuminated barn, conversation seemed to momentarily stop. Amelia felt dozens of eyes turning toward them, evaluating, speculating. Silas, naturally, placed his hand on the small of her back, a protective gesture that clearly communicated their relationship. "Miss Hartwell," greeted Reverend Phillips, approaching with a smile that oscillated between surprise and curiosity. "How pleasant to see you at our celebration, and I see you come accompanied." "Silas McCade," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Reverend." The dance continued around them, but Amelia was painfully aware of the furtive glances, the whispers behind hands, the heads that leaned in conversations that she was sure had her as the protagonist. Margaret Simmons, elegant as always in a green silk dress, observed her from the other end of the barn, with a mixture of disdain and poorly disguised curiosity. "Don't pay attention to them," murmured Silas, approaching to offer her a glass of punch. "They'll talk until they find something more interesting to occupy themselves with." "They've been talking about me for years," responded Amelia, taking a sip of the sweet drink. "The solitary daughter of William Hartwell, the woman nobody wanted. Now they simply have a new chapter for their story." Silas looked at her with that intensity that seemed to pierce all her defenses. "And what does the story they tell matter?" he asked softly. "The only thing that matters is the story you are living." Before Amelia could respond, the musicians began to play a slow waltz. Silas left his glass on a nearby table and extended his hand toward her. "Would you grant me this dance?" he asked, and there was in his voice a mixture of formality and tenderness that made Amelia's heart beat forcefully against her ribs. "I barely know how to dance," she confessed, feeling a sudden panic. "My father never considered it a necessary skill." "It's not so different from riding a horse," smiled Silas. "It's about trust and rhythm. I'll guide you." With a mixture of fear and anticipation, Amelia placed her hand in his and followed him to the center of the barn, where other couples were already spinning to the rhythm of the music. Silas placed a hand on her waist with delicacy, maintaining the appropriate distance that decency dictated, but close enough that she could feel the heat emanating from his body. The first steps were awkward, with Amelia constantly looking down, fearful of stepping on Silas's feet. But gradually, under his patient guidance, she found the rhythm. His hand on her waist was firm but gentle, communicating the direction with small pressures that her body quickly learned to follow. "Look up," whispered Silas. "Don't look at the floor, look at me." When Amelia raised her eyes and met his, the rest of the world seemed to vanish. The curious looks, the murmurs, even the music, all became secondary to the intensity of that connection. In Silas's eyes there was no judgment nor expectations, only an acceptance so complete that it was almost overwhelming. They spun around the improvised dance floor with a grace that Amelia would never have believed possible. Her dress swirled around her legs, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she felt light, almost ethereal, as if the weight she had carried for years had momentarily lightened. When the music came to an end, Silas didn't release her immediately. For an instant, they remained motionless in the middle of the floor, connected by something deeper than physical contact. "See," he murmured, with a smile that illuminated his eyes. "You dance beautifully." It was then that Amelia realized the looks that followed them no longer mattered to her, not because they had disappeared, but because they had lost their power over her. The way Silas looked at her, as if she were the only woman in the world, had redefined how she saw herself. That night, as they returned home under a starry sky, Amelia made a decision that had been forming in her heart for weeks. Upon reaching the cabin, instead of saying goodbye on the porch as was their custom, she took Silas's hand and looked him directly in the eyes. "Stay with me tonight," she said, and in her voice there was no shame nor doubt, only the quiet certainty of one who has found her way, not just under my roof, but in my bed, in my life. Silas brought her hand to his lips and kissed it with reverence. "There is nothing I desire more in this world," he responded, with a voice grave with emotion. "But I want you to be sure. There's no rush, Amelia." She smiled, feeling a security she had never before experienced. "I've waited all my life without knowing it," she said softly. "I don't want to wait any longer." That night, under the roof of a cabin that was gradually transforming into a home, Amelia Hartwell discovered that love, when offered and received with honesty, can be an act of healing as profound as any medicine. Summer advanced with the inexorability of a river that knows its destination. July gave way to August, and with it came days of intense heat that made the air undulate over the fields. The daily routine of Amelia and Silas had acquired its own rhythm, a silent dance of shared tasks and moments stolen between the responsibilities of the land. The cabin, which for so long had been simply a refuge, a place where Amelia survived, more than lived, began to transform. Silas, with his skilled hands and his builder's vision, had initiated improvements that went beyond simple repairs. The kitchen, before a functional but austere space, now had new shelves that he had patiently carved during the afternoons. The porch, once inclined and with loose boards, had been converted into a solid place to sit and contemplate the sunset. But the deepest changes weren't the physical ones. Amelia noticed how her own way of inhabiting the space had transformed. She no longer moved like an intruder in her own house, with that caution of one who fears making noise or leaving traces. Now her steps were firm, her gestures sure. The ghost of her father, who seemed to observe her with disapproval from every corner, had gradually vanished, like fog under the morning sun. One afternoon, while Silas worked on extending the back of the cabin, an ambitious project that would imply an additional room, Amelia found in the attic a box she hadn't opened in years. It contained her mother's scarce personal belongings, a hand-knitted shawl, some letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small silver mirror with engraved initials that didn't correspond to her name. Among these objects, she discovered an oval medallion that she remembered having seen on her mother's neck when she was a child. Upon opening it, she found a tiny hand-painted portrait, a young woman with the same oval face and deep eyes that Amelia had inherited. When Silas returned at nightfall, he found her sitting on the bed, contemplating the medallion with an expression that mixed nostalgia and discovery. "It was my mother's," she explained, showing him the portrait. "I had never looked inside before. My father stored all her things after her death, and when he finally allowed me access to them, I was already too old to play with jewelry." Silas sat beside her, taking the medallion with delicacy between his fingers stained with earth and resin. "She looks a lot like you," he commented, observing the small portrait. "She has the same look in her eyes." Amelia smiled, feeling a connection with her mother that transcended time and absence. "I would like to wear it," she said, more to herself than to Silas, "to feel that a part of her is with me." With careful movements, Silas placed the chain around Amelia's neck, his fingers lightly brushing the sensitive skin of her nape. The medallion rested right over her heart, with a weight that felt strangely comforting. "Do you think she would have liked him?" asked Amelia suddenly, and she didn't need to specify who she was referring to or what she meant. Silas looked at her with that tranquil intensity that seemed to penetrate to the deepest part of her being. "I think any mother would want to see her daughter find not only love but companionship," he responded in a soft voice. "To see that she isn't alone facing the world." That night, as they prepared for bed, Amelia contemplated the room they now shared. The bed that before had seemed too large for her alone, the 2 pairs of boots by the door, Silas's shirt hanging next to her dress. Small details that spoke of a shared life, of a home in formation. "I never imagined this," she confessed, while Silas extinguished the oil lamp. "For years I assumed my life would always be the same. Identical days, one after another, until the end." Silas approached her in the penumbra, his face barely visible in the tenuous light of the moon that filtered through the window. "Life has a curious way of surprising us," he said, caressing her cheek with gentle fingers. "Sometimes when we least expect it, it offers us exactly what we need." "And what did you need?" asked Amelia, lying down beside him. Silas was silent for a moment, as if looking for the exact words. "To build something with someone who doesn't scare easily," he finally responded. "Someone who sees beyond what already was, someone who helps me believe that the future can be different from the past." In the darkness, his lips found hers in a kiss that tasted of promise. Amelia felt her mother's medallion resting between them, like a silent witness to this new chapter that was beginning to be written. The next morning, when the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, Amelia found Silas on the porch, contemplating the property with evaluating eyes. In his hands he held a notebook where he had been drawing plans for the extension of the cabin. "I was thinking," he said when he felt her approach, "if we're going to expand the house, perhaps we should consider a space for a medicinal herb garden. Mrs. Peterson mentioned at the dance that basic remedies are lacking in town, and with your knowledge of plants—" He stopped upon seeing the expression on Amelia's face. "Did I say something incorrect?" he asked, worried. Amelia shook her head, feeling an emotion that tightened her throat. "It's just that you're thinking of a future here. A real future, with plans and purpose." Silas set the notebook aside and took her hands in his. "I'm not just thinking of a future, Amelia. I'm building it, with you, if that's what you desire as well." In that moment, under the golden light of dawn, with her mother's medallion resting over her heart and Silas's hands holding hers, Amelia felt that the foundations of her life, for so long uncertain, finally found firm ground. September arrived, with fresher winds and mornings, where fog clung to the fields like a diaphanous veil. It was harvest time when the fruits of months of work finally revealed themselves in all their abundance. The small garden that Amelia had expanded with Silas's help now offered a variety of vegetables she had never before managed to cultivate. Robust tomatoes, bright-skinned squashes, perfectly formed onions. The extension of the cabin advanced at a good pace. The new room already had walls and a roof, though details like windows and interior finishes were still lacking. Silas worked on it each afternoon after taking care of the more urgent tasks of the farm. His hands, which Amelia had learned to love as much for their strength as for their gentleness, seemed tireless when it came to building. "What do you think we'll use it for?" asked Amelia one afternoon, while she observed Silas installing the window frame that would face east, toward the distant mountains. He looked at her over his shoulder with that contained smile that made small wrinkles appear at the corners of his eyes. "Time will tell," he responded enigmatically. "A living house grows according to the needs of those who inhabit it." There was something in his tone, a hopeful quality, that made Amelia's heart beat a little faster. It wasn't the first time she felt that Silas was thinking of possibilities that she was just beginning to allow herself to imagine. A family, children, generations that would continue what they had begun. That same week, while Amelia organized the pantry for the approaching winter, she found a small carved wooden box that she didn't remember having seen before. Upon opening it, she discovered a simple ring, a silver band with a small sapphire that captured the light with blue flashes, the same tone as Silas's eyes. She said nothing about her discovery, intuiting that it was a surprise he was saving for the right moment. But from that day, she began to notice small changes in his behavior. More frequent trips to town with vague excuses, conversations that were interrupted when she approached, a kind of happy nervousness that wasn't characteristic of his usual serenity. One afternoon at the end of September, when the sun was setting and tinting the sky with copper and golden tones, Silas asked her to accompany him to the plum forest. The trees, which in spring had been covered with white flowers, now exhibited mature fruits of an intense red with purplish tints. The air smelled sweet and slightly fermented, of humid earth and fulfilled promise. In the same clearing where they had shared their first kiss months earlier, Silas had arranged a small blanket and a basket with some of the fruits from their garden, freshly baked bread, and the fresh cheese that Amelia had learned to make following the advice of Mrs. Johnson, a neighbor who, surprisingly, had become friendlier since Silas came into her life. "It's beautiful here, even in autumn," commented Amelia, observing how the light of sunset filtered through the leaves, creating golden patterns on the forest floor. "Each season has its own beauty," responded Silas, sitting beside her. "Like each stage of life." There was a contemplative silence while they shared the simple meal. Amelia noticed that Silas seemed distracted, almost nervous, a rare mood for him. "There's something I want to ask you," he said finally, after a long moment. "Something I've been thinking about for a while." He put his hand in his jacket pocket and extracted the small wooden box that Amelia had already discovered. Upon opening it and seeing the ring, she feigned surprise, though what she felt was genuine amazement at the beauty of the moment, the golden light of sunset, the plum trees laden with fruit, the face of the man who had transformed her life with his constant presence and patient love. "Amelia Hartwell," said Silas with a voice that mixed firmness and vulnerability. "I was never good with beautiful words. I'm not a poet or an orator, but I know what I feel and what I desire. I want to build a life with you, day by day, season after season. I want to be by your side when storms come and when the sun shines. I want your face to be the last thing I see each night and the first each morning." He paused, as if gathering courage. "Would you do me the honor of being my wife?" Though she had anticipated the moment, the emotion that invaded Amelia was overwhelming. Silas's words, simple but deeply sincere, touched something inside her that went beyond romantic love, a recognition that together they had found not only companionship but a shared purpose, a vision of the future that neither of them had believed possible before. "Yes," she responded with a voice she barely recognized as her own. "I can't imagine a greater happiness than building a life with you." Silas slid the ring onto her finger with slightly trembling hands. The sapphire caught a last ray of the setting sun, shining with a light that seemed to promise luminous days to come. That night, as they returned to the cabin hand in hand, Amelia felt that the property she had inherited from her father was finally completely transformed. It was no longer a place defined by absence and survival, but a home in the true sense of the word, a space where love was not only possible, but flourished with the same naturalness as the plants in her garden. Upon entering, she noticed that Silas had left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the table, along with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine that he must have been saving for the occasion. Small details that spoke of planning, of hope, of faith, that her answer would be affirmative. "I've been quite sure of my answer," she joked, pointing to the preparations. Silas smiled, lighting the lamps that bathed the room in a warm and welcoming light. "I wasn't sure," he admitted, "just hopeful, and willing to keep trying until you were ready, even if it took years." As they toasted to their shared future, Amelia thought about how far she had come since that spring afternoon when a stranger appeared at her door, soaked by the storm. How the loneliness that had been her constant companion had transformed into a warm presence at her side. How the fear of loving and being abandoned had given way gradually to confidence in a tomorrow built with patience and shared determination. The ring on her finger shone softly in the lamplight, a tangible symbol of promises that, for the first time in her life, Amelia fully believed would be fulfilled. Winter passed with its white mantle covering the prairie, isolating the cabin from the outside world, but creating an intimate space where Amelia and Silas consolidated their relationship. They married in a simple ceremony at the beginning of December, with only Reverend Phillips and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Margaret Simmons didn't attend, but sent a set of fine porcelain cups as a gift, a gesture that surprised Amelia as much as Mrs. Johnson's growing friendship. When March brought the first signs of thaw, Amelia began to feel the changes in her body, a different kind of tiredness from hard work, a new sensitivity, an intuition that was confirmed when her monthly cycle didn't arrive for the second time. The news filled Silas with a silent but deep joy. His hands, always gentle, acquired an almost reverential quality when they touched Amelia's belly, still flat but already harboring the promise of new life. The additional room he had built with such care during the autumn finally revealed its purpose. It would be the space for their child. With the same dedication with which he had repaired every corner of the cabin, Silas devoted himself to creating a wooden cradle, carving small forest animals on the headboard, a deer, a rabbit, a fox that seemed to observe with curious eyes. As the pregnancy advanced and Amelia's belly grew, a new dynamic was established between them. Silas assumed more physical tasks, insisting that she rest more, though Amelia, true to her independent nature, continued working in the garden and with the chickens until her condition allowed it. In the afternoons, when the day's work concluded, they had the custom of sitting on the porch, Amelia in the rocking chair that Silas had built especially for her, he on a low stool at her side. Sometimes they read aloud from the book of poems that had belonged to Amelia's mother. Other times, they simply contemplated the sunset in a shared silence that had become as eloquent as any conversation. It was during one of those summer evenings, when the heat was beginning to subside and a cool breeze caressed the fields, that Amelia felt the first contractions. The labor was long but without complications, with Mrs. Johnson assisting as an experienced midwife, and Silas alternating between moments of absolute calm and barely contained anxiety. At dawn, on the 3rd day of October, with the first rays of sun filtering through the window of the room, Jonah McCade was born, a boy with dark hair like his father, and eyes that, though they didn't yet reveal their definitive color, seemed to contain the same tranquil intensity. "He has your mouth," said Silas, observing the newborn with amazement, as he rested in Amelia's arms. "That determination in the line of the lips," Amelia smiled, exhausted but overflowing with a happiness she had never believed possible. "And your hands," she responded, pointing to the tiny fingers that closed with surprising strength around Silas's index finger. Builder's hands. The following days passed in that timeless nebula that only new parents know, where hours are measured, by feedings and brief sleeps, where each small change in the baby's face seems a miracle worthy of contemplation. Silas proved to be a father as dedicated as he had been a companion, rising in the middle of the night to bring Jonah from his cradle when he cried, changing diapers with the same precision with which he repaired roofs, singing old lullabies, with a deep voice that seemed to instantly calm the child. One afternoon, while Amelia fed Jonah sitting beside the window that faced the garden, now exuberant with the autumn harvest, she reflected on the path that had led her to this moment. She remembered the solitary young woman she had been, convinced that she would never know love nor form a family, the woman who had learned to harden her heart as a measure of protection against a world that seemed to offer her only solitude and hard work. And now, barely 2 years later, she held in her arms the fruit of a love that had arrived in the most unexpected way, with a stranger soaked by the storm who had asked for shelter one spring night. Silas entered the room, bringing with him the aroma of the exterior, fresh earth, freshly cut wood, the smoke from the chimney. He approached silently, observing his wife and son with an expression that mixed pride and humility. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed beside them. Amelia raised her gaze, meeting those blue eyes that she now knew so well, capable of showing firmness in the face of adversity and an infinite tenderness in moments like this. "About everything that has changed," she responded, caressing Jonah's cheek, who had fallen asleep on her chest. "About how life can transform completely when you least expect it." Silas nodded, understanding perfectly what she was referring to. "Sometimes I think about that day," he said in a quiet voice, "about how a simple lost horseshoe changed the course of our lives. If my horse hadn't limped, I would have continued on my way to Fort Benton without stopping." Amelia contemplated her sleeping son, his serene face that seemed to contain features of both her and Silas, but also something completely new and unique. "Perhaps it wasn't coincidence," she suggested, expressing a thought that had been forming inside her. "Perhaps some souls are destined to find each other, no matter how many detours they must take on the path." Silas took her free hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. The engagement ring and the simple wedding band shone softly in the light of sunset. "Are you still happy that you stayed?" asked Amelia, repeating the question she had asked him so many times during the first months, when the fear of abandonment still lurked in the shadows of her mind. Silas's answer remained the same, but now it contained a certainty that only shared time and fulfilled promises could grant. "Every day," he said, leaning to kiss first his son's forehead and then his wife's lips. "And each day a little more than the day before." 3 springs had passed since Jonah's arrival. The McCade-Hartwell property, as it was now known in town, had flourished as much as the family that inhabited it. The garden had expanded considerably, now including an area dedicated to medicinal herbs that Amelia cultivated, following the recipes of an old book that Mrs. Johnson had given her. The original cabin was barely recognizable, with its extensions and improvements, a wider porch that surrounded 2 sides of the house, larger windows that let in abundant light, a spacious kitchen where Amelia prepared preserves they sold in the town market. Jonah, who had just turned 2.5, was a child with rosy cheeks and an insatiable curiosity that kept his parents constantly alert. He had inherited Silas's serene eyes and Amelia's silent determination, a combination that promised a strong but reflective character. That May morning, while Jonah took his nap under the vigilance of Mrs. Johnson, who had become a kind of adoptive grandmother for the child, Silas took Amelia to the southern edge of the property. In his hands he carried a small plum tree that he had been secretly cultivating for months. "I thought we could plant it here," he said, pointing to a sunny space near the stream that marked the boundary of their lands. "So we'll have our own plum forest someday, without needing to ride to the other one." Amelia observed the small tree, barely taller than Jonah, with its thin but vigorous branches. It was such a typical gesture from Silas, practical and romantic at the same time, always thinking about the future they were building together. "It's perfect," she responded, feeling that familiar warmth that invaded her each time he demonstrated, with small acts more than with grand declarations, the depth of his commitment. Together they dug the hole, their hand, chairs working in perfect synchrony after years of shared labor. When the tree was firmly planted, Silas took from his pocket a small object that Amelia immediately recognized. The wooden figurine representing a deer, the first gift he had given her. "To watch over the tree," he explained, placing the small sculpture in a natural hollow in the young trunk, "and to remember how it all began." Amelia thought about that distant day, when a stranger appeared at her door during a storm. How that casual encounter had triggered such a profound transformation in her life that sometimes it was difficult for her to remember the solitary and distrustful woman she had been. "Do you know what Mrs. Peterson told me yesterday at the market?" she commented, as they returned toward the house hand in hand. "That we are the envy of the town, Not for the land or for the improvements on the property, but for what we've built together. She said she had rarely seen a marriage where both seemed so complete with each other. Silas smiled with that expression that combined humility and silent pride. Mrs. Peterson has always had a good eye for details, he responded. Though I'm surprised she would admit it so openly. She's changed, said Amelia, referring not only to the shopkeeper but to the general attitude of the town toward them. We've all changed. They stopped on the porch, contemplating their property bathed in the golden light of afternoon. From there they could see the flourishing garden, the expanded barn where they now kept not only Silas's horse and Amelia's mare, but also a colt born the previous spring, the chickens that pecked freely in the corral. A landscape so different from what Amelia had inherited, transformed by constant work and shared vision. Sometimes I wonder what my father would think of all this, said Amelia, her voice barely a whisper, of how his property has changed, of the family we've formed. Silas looked at her with that tranquil intensity that was so characteristic of him. I think he would be proud, he responded after a moment. Perhaps he wouldn't express it with words, but he would be. You've honored his legacy, Amelia. You've taken what he built and made it flourish. At that moment, Jonah's cry was heard from inside the house, followed by Mrs. Johnson's reassuring voice. Amelia smiled, recognizing in that sound the signal that the nap had ended, and her little whirlwind would soon be demanding attention. I should go help her, she said. But before she could move, Silas gently stopped her, taking her face between his hands. I love you, Amelia McCade, he said, with a simplicity that contained all the depth of the shared years. Each day a little more than the day before. Amelia leaned toward him, feeling the familiar warmth of his presence, the security of his arms that had become her home more than any wooden structure. And I love you, Silas McCade, she responded, more than I ever believed possible to love. The kiss they shared on the porch, with the sun slowly descending on the horizon, and the sound of their son calling them from inside, was as sweet and promising as the first they had exchanged years ago in the plum forest. A kiss that tasted of home, of family, of future. As they entered the house together, Amelia carried with her the certainty that the story they were writing day by day, season after season, was more beautiful than any dream she could have imagined in her years of solitude. A story made not of grand heroic gestures, but of small moments of shared truth, of hands that built together, of comfortable silences and sincere words. And at the southern edge of the property, the small, newly planted plum tree extended its roots toward the humid earth, promising flowers in future springs and fruits in coming summers. A living symbol of love that, like the most resistant of plants, had found a way to flourish even in the most improbable terrain.